So that was the reading on gossip and power in the workplace. It provides an interesting and functional model for the role of gossip in either increasing or decreasing power. I would say that there are more forms of power than the four outlined by Kurland and Peld, but I do appreciate that they need to simplify the concept of power in order to create such a neat and systematic typology concerning all the potential relations between gossip and power. And I like the moderating factors, the aggravating, the mitigating factors that they go over. So next we move on to the Parker reading on navigating workplace interactions. And of course we have another beautiful stock image. So this reading is interesting because it interviews a number of African American women executives in order to examine the interactions and encounters they have within their organizations, which they perceive as problematic and challenging due to the constraining white male dominated culture of these workplaces. So these workplace cultures can be very otherizing to those who don't fit into the subject position of the white male executive. So this reading goes through the strategies that these African American women executives use and adopt to navigate these raced and gendered workplace interactions. So Parker uses standpoint analysis to kind of put herself and put the reader in the shoes, in the perspective, in the viewpoint from the standpoint of these African American women executives. A standpoint analysis offers considerable insight into how a person's subject position within culture shapes their life, and how gendered and raced positions within society shape how individuals are perceived, how others interact with them and expect them to interact with others, the opportunities they receive, the ways they need to strategize around their communication, basically guiding what that individual knows and feels and does, and directing their understanding of social life as a whole. So this approach contends that many of us are in relatively privileged enough positions in life and society to have perspectives on society that, even though we're well-intentioned, similar to the doctors on the week of medical discourse, we may not be privy to the real relations that are at play between humans and the material working world. There's a lot of harshness and ugliness to the underside of human existence that's kind of glossed over, so that people who don't experience it directly have no idea of what's going on or the extent of its severity. So we have only a partial vision of, the social and the economic systems at place or in place or at work in society. We have an incomplete picture of these relations, of these human relations and these material relations. So in order to get a more complete picture, we need to consult the perspective of the oppressed, because they are exposed to things and they witness things such as the inequalities and the struggles that are made invisible to the rest of society through ideology. So we're basically trying to take positions that have been otherized by existing discourse and, occupy that standpoint, that subject position in order to de-otherize it, so that the people who occupy them for a living can more easily exist and possess meaning within discourse. So in this reading, the standpoint that's being adopted is one of the Black woman leadership, which has been historically underlooked or undervalued or excluded altogether when it comes to the discourse surrounding organizational communication and organizational power. We can't see the invisible restraints that are put on these individuals by the constraining culture. So we need to let them speak for themselves through interviews so that we can begin to see things from their standpoint and better visualize and materialize these struggles so that we can easier identify them and change them. So we can get a definition of organizational culture from the Kurland and Peld reading. Actually, I think it works well for this purpose, in that it's the system of shared values that define what is important and norms that define appropriate attitudes and behaviors for organizational members. So that's a good working definition. And the culture cultivated by a workplace through the various mechanisms that we mentioned, the dress code, the structure, the rules, the regulations, the meetings, the architectural layout, and the floor plan and design, and the hierarchies and the informal networks, the norms, the values. All these things provide the setting, the context in which each workplace interaction occurs. Each workplace interaction doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's situated within that whole structure, that whole discourse, and all of its elements. So that whether we know it or not, our interactions are being subtly constrained to influence how each interaction unfolds. So who should speak to who, about what topics, under what circumstances, all those things are being subtly constrained and influenced by the overarching workplace culture. And in many workplaces, the dominant culture tends to favor individuals who reflect that gender and ethnicity and class background of those who are formally and informally in charge, while putting those who aren't well represented by said discourse at a marginalized position and a disadvantage when it comes to accessing or gaining power. So there are certain subject positions, particularly the white upper class male subject positions, like we talked about in the old boys club part of last week's lecture, who fit right into this culture. Everything, they just enter into a workplace and just their values, their behavior, their norms are already aligned with the workplace culture, so that they seem to navigate freely, and they don't need to change anything about themselves in order to fit in. Whereas others in subject positions such as the black female executive don't fit in as readily. They're more conscious and aware of the disjunctive nature of the workplace culture that they're in compared to their own subjectivity. So they see problems where their white male colleagues might not, because for them things are as they have always been, without obstacle or challenge or adversity. Whereas for the black female executive, it's much more apparent that practices and behaviors that are considered taken for granted by their white male colleagues aren't and shouldn't be the default way of doing things for everyone within that organization. So the dominant culture within a workplace tends to hegemonically suppress and devalue and silence any voices or subject positions that go against the privileges of the dominant culture, interests, and experiences. So the discourse at work within these organizations tends to allow for certain subject positions to fit in more seamlessly than others. And the black female executives in this reading have to confront and challenge the aspects of the culture that prevent them from fitting in order to change the discourse and open up new subject positions in which they can find security and success, because those things aren't readily given to them by the existing culture and its discourse. So the reading then goes into three challenges, three obstacles, three conflicts that black female executives encounter from their white male colleagues. We're going to call them WMCs for brevity purposes. Weapons of mass construction, like discursive construction. So these are two parties who clearly see things differently. The WMCs fit in so seamlessly with the dominant culture of the organization that they don't see any problems, and it's up to the women executives to problematize for it, to show it how it is a problem. Because a lot of times these struggles, these conflicts are caused by unintended or taken for granted assumptions on the part of the WMCs. Just old habits die hard, and they may be well-intentioned, but they don't realize that they could be sending the wrong messages. So in these instances, the executive had to show the problem, had to express the struggle to the WMC by identifying and describing her perception of what the conflict is. So one of their options when navigating through interactions with WMCs is to pursue indirect strategies in response or reaction to interpersonal conflict, such as altering their communication in ways that won't be perceived as threatening. Because a lot of WMCs might feel threatened that a woman of color is their superior in this working relationship, and they may lash out or react in negative ways that, again, they're not intentionally aware of. So one of the interviewees says, I try not to be overly assertive. I try to, I guess, conform to their perceptions of a female in that I ask very gingerly things that I want done. I am not as direct as I might be if I wasn't aware of their problems with the fact that I'm the first female they've ever had to deal with in that way. So this is a case of strategically navigating through the workplace interaction in a delicate matter so as to get what you need done, but in a way that is coherent with the WMC's perception of the situation. So he doesn't want to be bossed around by a woman of color. But if the interaction is made to seem like the executive is like asking politely in like a feminine way, then it might make that WMC feel like he's doing the executive a favor, like he's doing, something to feel good about himself, even though he was going to be ordered to do it otherwise. It's like that saying, you catch more bees with honey than vinegar or something like that. Even though a lot of these executives report, wanting to use a more direct communication style, this is a strategic way to accommodate the WMC's skewed point of view and recreate a space for her voice to be heard effectively. Another executive was reported dealing with race and gender issues through more avoidance strategies by just focusing on her work and modeling excellence. By that we mean letting the results speak for themselves. Do such a good, perfect, flawless job that it's impossible for anyone to point out anything wrong with what you're doing. So this interviewee is recorded saying, I always assumed that I would never be allowed to do less than perfect. I have never felt from the first day I came to this organization that I could do anything less than perfect. The things that my white counterpart VPs are forgiven for, like not making their profit numbers or not making their customer numbers or not gaining market share, I don't think I would have ever been allowed. So there's a double standard here that's very entrenched. People are more likely to pick apart the black female executive's work, trying to find things to criticize her for that would have been forgiven or not even noticed if their white counterparts have done it. So this obviously isn't fair that you need to do like twice as good of a job as any of your counterparts in order to even get half of their respect or the recognition. And a second challenge faced by these African American women executives with regards to their WMCs is encountering attempts at subordination or insubordination through perceived exclusionary practices, such as being excluded from important meetings or workplace networks. So in the background of this slide, you have D'Angelo from The Office, played by Will Ferrell, once Michael Scott left and the series went a bit downhill. And he has his own boys club. I forgot the name. I think it was called The Inner Circle, where he had his own guys that he'd call into his office for like a secret meeting. And this is where everything gets done. And if you're excluded from that meeting, then you're not a part of the inner circle. You're not one of the movers and shakers. You don't hold a lot of power or influence within that organization. So one interviewee is quoted as saying, I was working for a gentleman that promoted me to district level, so I have some loyalty to him, but he still has, his old network of guys around him. He has his club of guys that are his guys, and they're his guys. You have to send 3 or 4 memos where they send no memo. You send a memo and 3 voicemails to make sure you're even heard. So these WMCs kind of form their own exclusionary inner circle. And excluded are the black female executives who need to find a way in or get some sort of access. So again, they need to navigate strategically. For example, some women who were excluded from information networks created their own information networks. Or they obtain at least one contact within that inner circle from whom they could extract information. So you could maybe get a hold of Andy or Kevin. They seem the most manipulable, easily manipulated. maybe offer Kevin some M&Ms or something in exchange for information about whatever they talked about with that inner circle boys club. And the third challenge that these interviewed women executives faced with regards to their WMCs was having their ideas co-opted or ignored during meetings. So one of the interviewees said, you'll sit in a meeting or be in a conference call, and the white males will be talking loud and aggressively, and they like to hear each other talk. You can say something and get no attention. They will say the same thing, basically restating what you said, not as clearly as you did, by the way, and all of a sudden it's a good idea. So they're co-opting the black female executives' ideas. They're taking their ideas and making it seem like their own. Basically plagiarism, but it's quite bold when you're plagiarizing someone who's directly in the room with you immediately after they propose the idea in the first place. So their ideas will either be stolen or just ignored outright. Because these meetings, they often take place under certain conversational patterns. Like you remember the week on conversation, where we talk about, some people are used, some groups are used to specific patterns of pitch and pacing and loudness and volume and all that stuff. Where if you're not attuned to that specific conversational pattern, it could leave you no opportunities to be part of the conversation. And again, a lot of the times the WMCs are unaware of just how problematic this is for others who don't fit in to that style, that pattern, that subject position. They just see what they're doing as normal behavior. Another interviewee is quoted saying, how do you compete then? You can't compete on the rhetoric, which means you can't win at their game by playing by the same rules that they're playing by, because they're not designed to work out in your favor. They're all playing chess with a full array of kings and queens and knights and rooks or whatever. And if you try to play chess with them, they'll give you one or two pawns. That's all you're afforded. That's all the power you're given within that rhetoric. So you need to change the game entirely. They're playing chess. You got to go in there with some checkers to reset the relations between you and your coworkers within a different game entirely. One that doesn't handicap you or disadvantage you from the beginning. So this is tough, and it needs to be negotiated strategically and delicately. Like the final quote on this slide says, a lot of times if you don't bang on the table, you won't get what you want, you won't be heard. But when you do bang on the table, very often what your WMCs will hear is the banging on the table and not what you have to say. So they'll just see a mad person banging on the table, and that'll discredit them even further. So you have to balance between being confrontational and asserting yourself in these situations, but also not doing it in a way that people will discount your confrontations. So you could potentially use humor perhaps to call out a problem within the workplace. Like if you're not being heard in a meeting, you can kind of point it out in a way that it's comedic, diffuses the situation. Like, oh, what am I, chopped liver over here? Like, what am I, yesterday's tomatoes? Tough crowd over here. Cut me some slack. Like, just broach the issue in a way that is confronting the issue, but in a non-confrontational way. So those are three challenges that these African American women executives face with regards to white male colleagues, being ignored or have their ideas co-opted during meetings, having no access to important social networks within the workplace, and also encountering interpersonal conflicts with WMCs, even when the WMCs aren't aware that a conflict even exists. But then the interviewees also revealed two other challenges related to their interactions with other African Americans. The first one is based on perceived unmet expectations about the executive's behavior toward African Americans. So they're expected to give fellow African Americans a break, or kind of give them some unfair advantages just because they're both African American. And then the second one is just personal attacks on the executive's character due to these unmet perceived expectations. So, oh, you're a sellout, or you're a traitor, or you're an Uncle Tom, or you're helping the oppressor. All these personal attacks just due to the executive doing their job properly and trying to be fair to everyone. So people in leadership positions are often being pulled in multiple directions by multiple competing interests, and it's hard to borderline impossible to please everyone, thus requiring some difficult decisions to be made and some principles to be stood upon. So, for example, an executive had to stick with their principles when they were confronted by a fellow African American saying, "We need to help each other." And they said to him, "We need to help each other help ourselves. We can't continue putting government money into a project that you're not going to maintain. And it doesn't matter whether I'm helping you or I'm helping Joe Blow. I would expect the same thing from you that I would expect from anyone else." So the guy in this situation, the client, is trying to like pull the race card a little bit and be like, "Hey, let's do each other a favor here." But doing that favor would come at the expense of the executive doing her job. So she has to be firm and fair and reframe the situation, reframe the interaction to focus on the topic at hand, on the work at hand, to kind of detract or deflect from any personal attacks, or trying to bring the personal side into it and just make it clear her position as an executive and focus on the task at hand.